Attacks against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are on the rise nationwide, but New York City in particular has been hit hard by the violence. Data from the city's police department was compiled by California State University's Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism. They found anti-Asian hate crimes in New York City spiked 933% in 2020. Experts say hate crimes are vastly underreported, and those numbers are likely much higher. Upon taking office, President Biden signed an executive order condemning the incident, but lawmakers say more needs to be done. Tri-caucus leaders are calling on Congress to pass the No Hate Act. It would standardize hate crime reporting and provide training to local law enforcement. For more on this, let's bring in Arun Venugopal. He's a senior reporter at WNYC in New York, covering race and immigration for its Race and Justice unit. Arun, welcome. Thanks very much for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Elaine.
So, Arun, talk to us about the situation in New York City. Is there a specific area where we see these kinds of attacks happening? And can you shed light on the issue of potential underreporting of these kinds of attacks?
Yeah, it is certainly really startling, first of all, the numbers that you just raised in terms of the extent to which you would see hate crimes happening in New York City, a city that has a very proud reputation as being a place that is safe for people of various backgrounds, ethnicities. And these incidents are happening in various neighborhoods, in various boroughs. They're happening in Asian majority neighborhoods as well. Hate crimes by the official sort of legal definition, as well as the other kinds of incidents. You see people just getting shoved, spat upon, coughed at, harassed, called names, ethnic slurs. These things are happening, hundreds of incidents that have been documented by the Asian American Federation, and many, many more, most likely, that are going unreported because people they don't really know what to do with that information. They go on with their lives. They may not speak the language. They may not even know what exactly happened if they don't speak English. So this is a huge problem. And I think the fact that it's happening in places like Flushing, Queens, in Manhattan, Chinatown, is causing a lot of distress for members of the Asian American community.
So, Arun, we've covered on this program and others on CBSN this issue quite a bit. And in those discussions, we have gone over how there really is nothing new about anti-Asian bias, that the sentiment itself has been with the United States for decades. We know this, but this recent spike that we've seen in actual harassment and violence against Asian Americans, when you look at the data, there is a pronounced spike in the reports of these incidents since the start of the pandemic, and many have looked to the rhetoric of the former administration as part of the reason why. But it's interesting because you've done some reporting specifically with respect to law enforcement officials in New York City about why AAPIs, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, might be targeted specifically. Can you talk about that? Because that's not something I've heard a lot of discussion about.
Yeah, it was a question I put to Deputy Inspector Stuart Liu, who oversees a new unit in the NYPD known as the Asian Hate Crime Task Force. I said, I've heard this from another member of the community, an Asian American community leader. He said he thinks the problem is that Asians are seen as soft targets, quote unquote. And this is something that Deputy Inspector Liu said, yes, that is exactly what it is. This term soft target is what he thinks is the problem, is that he said, when I speak to people who've robbed Asian Americans, I ask them, why did you do this? And he's asking this as an Asian American person himself. And he says that very often they do say, like, we don't expect them to fight back or to report it. They just kind of, take it and move on. He said something else that I think is highly controversial. He said, it's not because they're Asian. It's because they're seen as soft targets. And I think that's something that raises a lot of eyebrows because some people in the community, many people would say it's very much because they're Asian, because this is, you could say, a cultural construct. It's a way in which Asian Americans have been portrayed as people who don't fight back, who are passive. And I think more importantly that other New Yorkers or the political establishment won't necessarily rush to their aid to help them out, to show that they have solidarity. These are huge issues. Like you said, they are decades in the making, maybe even a century or more in the making, really. And so it's really something that requires a lot of heavy thinking. And it's something that's being heavily contested within the community itself. How do you do this?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And I'm so glad we have the chance to talk to you today, because each time we talk about it, it gives us a chance to delve a little bit deeper into this, which is so complex. So one thing, Arun, that we know as well from these reports is that they range in severity, but they also range with respect to the perpetrators themselves and their backgrounds. It's not sort of just one type of person behind these attacks against AAPIs. But what are you seeing, Arun, with respect to the response in New York City? Can you tell us about what the reaction has been in the wake of this recent surge of attacks?
Yes, I think you're seeing increasingly the conversation going towards how do we forge solidarity between different communities. If the attacks are coming from people of different racial backgrounds, they're coming from people who are white, who are Black, who are Hispanic, who are South Asian, then it forces all of us to really look at this problem in a more complex way, and also to try to forge ties between different communities, and for leaders of different backgrounds to step forward, which is something that's been happening at some of these rallies, is you have people of different backgrounds, political leaders, community leaders coming forward and saying that this has to end. Obviously, nothing is expected to end overnight. It's very hard to put the genie back in this bottle. These are very, these are intense problems that come forward at moments of distress, and they're brought forward by language of xenophobia, whether it's from President Trump, former President Trump, or by other people. And however, one solution, though, is to create the sense that Asians are not isolated, that they are in this with the support of people of different backgrounds, that New Yorkers are not going to tolerate these kinds of attacks on them.
And Arun, before we let you go, just sort of systemically here, does there appear to be some sort of consensus when you look at local leaders, when you look at the AAPI population and community in New York City, about what it might actually take to effectively tackle this problem? Or is it still very much just trying to get the message out there that these attacks are even happening at all?
No, I think it is very much right now just that, trying to get the message out. Certainly people in the Asian American community are taking note of the fact there's a lot more media attention. There's more complex ways of addressing this. The actual solutions, I think, are very much being debated. Is policing the solution, as some political leaders think? Andrew Yang, a mayoral candidate, has advocated for that. Letitia James, the New York State Attorney General, is advocating putting more resources into NYPD to go after people who are committing these crimes. Other people say, this is not the solution, that policing only compounds the problem. So there are very intense debates happening right now. Maybe we should be putting more community resources into mental health and to creating dialogue on the ground. People who are unemployed or facing economic distress, are they lashing out at people who look Asian? Again, very complicated problems. Is it more about social services, or is it more about law enforcement? And I think it's going to be a while before we really see some resolution to these.
Senior reporter at WNYC, Arun Venugopal. Arun, thanks very much.
Thanks.